The Varkorian Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. Their ships were made of living crystal that could heal itself after battle. Their weapons could burn entire planets to ash in hours. They had conquered hundreds of species across the galaxy, and no one had ever stopped them. When humans first left Earth and built colonies among the stars, the Varkorians watched with mild interest. These small, soft creatures were not a threat. They had only a handful of worlds. Their ships were slow and weak. Their weapons were toys compared to Imperial technology. But humans were useful. They were good traders. They made interesting art. They asked questions that other species had stopped asking long ago. So the Empire offered them a treaty instead of conquest. The Treaty of Neutral Stars was signed 30 years before the day everything changed. It promised peace between humans and the Empire. Human colonies could trade freely. Human ships could travel through Imperial space. In exchange, humans would not build weapons of war or challenge Imperial authority. It was not a fair treaty. Everyone knew that. But humans had no choice. They accepted the terms and hoped for the best. For 30 years, the peace held. Human colonies grew and prospered. Diplomats traveled between species, building friendships and trade agreements. Children grew up believing that the galaxy was a place of wonder and opportunity. Daniel Carter was one of those children once. He had grown up on Earth, dreaming of the stars. He had studied languages and cultures, learned how to talk to species that thought in ways humans could barely understand. He became a diplomat, spending 15 years traveling the galaxy, solving problems with words instead of weapons. He married a woman named Grace, who shared his love of exploration. They had a daughter named Sophie, and for 7 years Daniel thought his life was perfect. Then Grace got sick. The disease was rare and aggressive, and even the best human doctors could not save her. She died holding Daniel's hand. Asking him to take care of their little girl, Daniel moved to a colony called New Haven after that. It was a quiet world, far from the busy trade routes, a good place to raise a child. Sophie loved it there. She made friends at school. She drew pictures of spaceships and alien animals. She asked her father endless questions about the galaxy and all the strange and wonderful things in it. Daniel told her stories every night before bed. Stories about the Selvar, with their silver skin and sad songs. Stories about the Kelthari, who built cities that floated in the clouds. Stories about humans, who were small but brave and clever. He never told her stories about the Varkorians. Some things were too frightening for a 7-year-old girl. The morning everything ended started like any other. Daniel made breakfast while Sophie talked about a project she was doing at school. She wanted to build a model of a human starship. She had drawn designs in her notebook, filling pages with careful sketches and labels. Daniel smiled and told her she would make a wonderful engineer someday. Then the sky turned red. The sound came first, a deep rumble that shook the windows and made the dishes rattle. Daniel grabbed Sophie and ran to the window just in time to see the first Varkorian warship break through the clouds. It was enormous, a mountain of crystal that blocked out the sun, and it was not alone. Behind it came more ships, dozens of them, filling the sky from horizon to horizon. Daniel's training took over. He pulled Sophie away from the window and ran for the basement. Every colony had emergency shelters. Every child was taught what to do in case of attack. But no one really believed it would happen. The treaty protected them. The Empire had no reason to strike. The first beam hit the city center just as Daniel reached the basement stairs. The sound was like nothing he had ever heard. A scream of tearing metal and burning air that went on and on and on. He threw himself over Sophie, covering her body with his own as the world above them came apart. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of fire and thunder, and the endless screaming of a world being murdered. Daniel held his daughter in the darkness and told her it would be okay. He told her they would survive. He told her everything would be fine. He was lying when the silence finally came. Daniel climbed out of the basement to find a graveyard. New Haven was gone. The city he had called home was nothing but smoke and ash. Bodies lay everywhere, burned beyond recognition. The air was thick with the smell of death. He called Sophie's name. He dug through rubble with his bare hands until they bled. He searched for hours, screaming her name until his voice gave out. He found her near what had been their house. A piece of falling debris had struck the basement entrance. She had been trying to follow him up the stairs. Daniel held his daughter's body and did not cry. Something inside him had gone cold and hard, like ice forming over a deep lake. He sat there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just holding the small, broken thing that had been his entire world. Other survivors found him eventually. They took Sophie's body away. They gave Daniel water and food that he did not taste. They put him on a rescue ship and took him to a station where the wounded were being treated. 3 days later, the Galactic Council convened to discuss what had happened. Daniel was there. He had cleaned himself up and put on his diplomatic clothes. He sat in the human delegation seats and watched as representatives from 37 species gathered to talk about the murder of 200,000 people. The Varkorian ambassador was a creature called High Speaker Malthus. He was 12 feet tall, covered in plates of natural armor, with eyes like pools of liquid gold. He stood before the council without any sign of shame or regret. The humans had violated the treaty, Malthus explained. Subsection 47, paragraph 12. They had been building weapons in secret. The attack was a correction, nothing more. The Empire considered the matter closed. It was a lie. Everyone in the room knew it was a lie. New Haven had no weapons. There had been no violation. The Varkorians had simply decided to remind the galaxy who was in charge. The council offered condolences. They suggested mediation. They formed committees to investigate. They did nothing that mattered. Daniel watched it all with his cold, frozen heart. He did not speak. He did not protest. He simply watched and remembered. That night, he requested a private meeting with High Speaker Mal. The U.S. No one knows exactly what Daniel said in that room. The conversation was not recorded. But when Malthus emerged, something had changed in the ancient alien's golden eyes. Those who saw him would later say he looked troubled, uncertain, almost afraid. Daniel Carter walked out of the room behind him, and his face showed nothing at all. The next morning, he returned to his diplomatic duties. He smiled when appropriate. He attended meetings. He shook hands with Varkorian officials. He never mentioned his daughter, or his dead colony, or the fire that had taken everything from him. But something had begun. Something quiet and patient, and very, very dangerous. The first seed had been planted in darkness, and soon it would begin to grow. 6 months passed after the burning of New Haven. The galaxy moved on. News feeds stopped talking about the massacre. Other events filled the headlines. The Varkorian Empire continued as it always had, and most people simply forgot. But Daniel Carter did not forget. He returned to his work as a diplomat. He traveled between space stations and colonies, attending trade negotiations and cultural exchanges. He smiled at parties. He made pleasant conversation with officials from a dozen different species. He seemed like the same man he had always been. Only those who looked closely could see that. Something had changed. Daniel's eyes were different now. They were still warm when he spoke, still kind when he listened. But underneath that warmth was something hard and cold. Something that never went away, no matter how brightly he smiled. He hired a young assistant named Katie Morgan to help with his work. She was smart and eager, fresh from the diplomatic academy on Earth. She believed in building bridges between species. In solving problems through understanding and cooperation, Daniel had believed those things once. 2. Katie noticed things about her new boss that confused her. He spent long hours in private conversations with minor officials that most diplomats ignored. He took meetings with disgraced nobles and failed merchants. He visited poor colonies that had nothing to offer in terms of trade or politics. When she asked him about it, he simply smiled and said he was building connections. That was what diplomats did, but Katie was not stupid. She kept watching. On a station called Terminus 7, Daniel met with a group of Selvari traders. The Selvari were a sad species. They had silver skin and voices like music, and they had been conquered by the Varkorians 800 years ago. Their homeworld had been stripped of resources. Their people had been scattered across the empire as servants and laborers. They had no power. They had no hope. They had accepted their fate long ago. The Selvari elder was a female named Tessari. She was old, even by her species standards, and she had seen generations of her people live and die under imperial rule. She met with Daniel in a small room behind her trading post. Wondering what a human diplomat could possibly want from her, Daniel talked to her for hours. He asked about her people's history, their culture, their songs. He listened carefully to everything she said. Then he began to talk about human history. He told her about times when small groups had fought against powerful empires. He spoke of aliens and revolutions of ordinary people who had found the courage to stand up against impossible odds. He explained strategies and tactics, ways that the weak could challenge the strong. Tessari listened with growing unease. "Your species is very young," she said finally. "You do not understand what the Empire will do to anyone who challenges them. We tried once. 100 years ago, they burned 3 of our remaining colonies as punishment. We learned our lesson."
Oh.
Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "The Empire rules through fear. They have made everyone in the galaxy afraid to even think about resistance." "Then why are you telling me these things?" Daniel leaned forward. In the dim light of the small room, his eyes seemed to glow with something cold and terrible. "Because fear works both ways," he said softly. "The Empire has taught you to be afraid of them, but they have never learned to be afraid themselves. They have never faced consequences for what they do. They believe they can burn worlds and murder children, and nothing will ever happen to them." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I am going to teach them differently." Tessari stared at him for a long moment. Then she asked the question that would change everything. "How?" Daniel smiled. It was not a warm smile. Over the next 18 months, Daniel traveled constantly. He visited colonies and stations across the galaxy, always on diplomatic business, always meeting with people who had reasons to hate the Empire. He met with Kelthari scientists, whose research had been stolen by Nene, imperial officials. He talked to Voroth merchants whose trade routes had been seized without compensation. He sat with retired Varkorian officers who had been cast aside. After years of loyal service, he never asked anyone to do anything illegal. He never mentioned rebellion or revolution. He simply listened to their stories, shared information, and helped people connect with others who shared their frustrations. It was diplomacy of a different kind. Instead of building bridges between governments, Daniel was building bridges between the angry and the forgotten. Instead of solving problems, he was collecting them. Katie watched it all with growing worry. She confronted Daniel one evening on a transport ship traveling between stations. "I know what you are doing," she said. "You are building a network. You are connecting all the people who have reasons to hate the Varkorians." Daniel looked up from the document he was reading. "That is an interesting theory." "It is not a theory. I have been watching you for over a year. Every person you meet, every conversation you have, it all points in the same direction." She sat down across from him. "You are planning something." "I am a diplomat," Daniel said calmly. "I talk to people. That is my job. Your daughter died on New Haven." The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "She did. Now you are trying to destroy the empire that killed her." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and steady. "The Varkorians have ruled through fear for 12,000 years. They have burned worlds and enslaved species and murdered millions, and no one has ever made them pay. They believe they are above consequences. They believe that power means the right to do whatever they want." He closed his document and met Katie's eyes. "My daughter drew pictures of spaceships. She wanted to explore the galaxy and make friends with every species she met. She was 7 years old and they killed her to make a point. To remind everyone that the Empire can do whatever it wants." His voice never rose, but there was something in it that made Katie want to look away. I am not building an army. I am not planning a war. I am simply helping people understand that they are not alone. That their anger is not weakness. That the Empire is not as invincible as they pretend to be. He smiled again, that cold and terrible smile. Fear is the Empire's greatest weapon. I am going to take it away from them. Katie did not know what to say. She wanted to argue, to tell him that what he was doing was dangerous and foolish. But she looked at his eyes and saw the frozen lake beneath. She knew that nothing she said would make any difference. Daniel Carter had already made his choice. The seeds he had planted were already growing. And somewhere in the darkness, the first cracks were starting to form in an empire that had stood for 12,000 years. 2 years after the destruction of New Haven, strange things began happening across the Varkorian Empire. At first, the problems seemed small. A mining station in the Outer Territories lost all its equipment to mysterious software failures. A diplomatic summit between imperial governors was ruined when secret documents were leaked to the press. A Varkorian general died when his personal transport malfunctioned during takeoff. The Imperial Security Council investigated each incident separately. They found no connection between them. Each problem had a different cause, a different method, a different set of suspects. It was as if the universe itself was turning against the Empire. But the problems kept growing. 3 governors were killed within a single month, each murdered by servants who had worked for them for decades. A major trade fleet was hijacked by its own crew, who disappeared into uncharted space with billions in cargo. Protests erupted on a dozen colony worlds, demanding rights and freedoms that no one had dared to ask for in centuries. High Speaker Malthois called an emergency meeting of the Imperial Council. The greatest minds in the Empire gathered to analyze the crisis and find a solution. They found nothing. There was no enemy to fight, no organization to destroy, no leader to capture. The problems came from everywhere and nowhere. They were connected only by timing, and even that connection was impossible to prove. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter continued his diplomatic work. He attended a trade conference on Station Primus and negotiated a minor agreement between human merchants and Kelthari suppliers. He visited a Varkorian cultural exhibit and made polite conversation with imperial officials. He gave a speech at a memorial service for victims of a transport accident, wherever he went. He was the same calm, professional diplomat he had always been. He never spoke of revenge. He never mentioned New Haven. He smiled and shook hands and did his job, but Katie Morgan was not fooled. She had been watching Daniel for 2 years now. She had seen the patterns in his movements, the connections between the people he met. Every time something went wrong for the Empire, Daniel had been somewhere nearby in the weeks before. He never did anything himself. His hands were always clean, but somehow information flowed through him like water through a river. Angry people found each other. Plans formed in secret meetings. Actions were taken by individuals who believed they were acting alone. Daniel was the center of a web that stretched across the galaxy, and he was so careful that no one could prove it existed. The Selvari Rebellion began in the 3rd year. It started small. Workers refused to show up at Imperial factories. Ships failed to deliver cargo on time. Officials found their orders ignored by servants who had obeyed without question for generations. Then it grew larger. Selvari colonists on a dozen worlds organized protests. They demanded the return of their homeland. They called for an end to forced labor. They sang their sad songs in public squares. For the first time in 800 years, those songs had words of defiance. The Empire responded with force. They sent soldiers to restore order. They arrested protest leaders. They made examples of troublemakers. But for every leader they arrested, 2 more appeared. For every protest they crushed, 3 more began. The Selvari had been broken for centuries, but now something had changed. They had found hope. Tessari, the old traitor Daniel had met on Terminus 7, became the voice of the rebellion. She spoke to crowds and news feeds, calling for peaceful resistance. She told her people that they were not alone, that others across the galaxy shared their struggle. She never mentioned Daniel Carter. She never knew how much he had done to make this moment possible. She believed the rebellion had grown naturally from the anger of her people. That was exactly what Daniel wanted. The Kelthari were next. They had always been a proud species, building their floating cities in the clouds of gas giant planets. They had submitted to imperial rule only to avoid destruction. They had never forgiven the humiliation. When the Selvari rebellion showed that resistance was possible, Kelthari found their courage. They announced that they were withdrawing from all trade agreements with the Empire. They closed their borders to imperial ships. They began building defenses that the treaty had forbidden. The Empire threatened war. The Kelthari did not back down. Across the galaxy, other species watched and wondered. If the Selvari could rebel, if the Kelthari could defy imperial threats, perhaps change was truly possible. Perhaps the Empire was not as invincible as everyone believed. Daniel Carter observed it all with quiet satisfaction. The seeds he had planted were bearing fruit. The connections he had built were coming alive. The Empire was facing something it had never encountered before, an enemy it could not see. High Speaker Malthus finally understood what was happening. He called his intelligence chiefs together and demanded answers. "Find the source," he ordered. "There must be someone coordinating this. Someone pulling the strings." They searched for months. They analyzed communications and tracked movements. They interrogated suspects and studied patterns. Eventually, one name kept appearing at the edges of their investigations. A human diplomat who had lost his daughter on New Haven. A man who had been traveling the galaxy for years, meeting with just the right people at just the right times. Daniel Carter. But they had no proof. Daniel had been careful. Every meeting had an innocent explanation. Every connection could be dismissed as coincidence. He had never written anything down. He had never given orders. He had simply talked to people and let them draw their own conclusions. Malthus stared at the reports on his desk and felt something he had not experienced in centuries. It was a cold feeling in his chest, a tightness in his throat. It took him a long time to recognize it. It was fear. A single human had done this. One small, soft creature from a weak young species. He had taken the Empire's own weapon and turned it against them. He had made the Masters afraid, and he was not finished yet. For years after the burning of New Haven, the Varkorian Empire was falling apart. The numbers told the story. 18 colony worlds had declared open rebellion. The Selvari resistance had spread to every world where their people lived. The Kelthari had formed alliances with 3 other species and created a military force that could actually challenge imperial fleets. But the numbers did not tell the whole truth. The real damage was invisible. It was in the hearts and minds of imperial citizens who had begun to doubt. It was in the officers who questioned their orders. It was in the governors who wondered if they might be the next to fall. The Empire had always ruled through fear. Now fear was everywhere, but it was pointing in a new direction. Varkorian officials were afraid of their own servants. Military commanders were afraid of their own troops. The High Council was afraid of the future, and they were all afraid of Daniel Carter. The human diplomat had become a legend. No one could prove he had done anything wrong, but everyone knew the truth. He had taken a galaxy full of anger and shaped it into a weapon. He had found the cracks in an ancient empire and widened them into chasms. High Speaker Malthus decided to act directly. If the law could not touch Daniel Carter, then power would have to speak for itself. He summoned the human to the imperial capital. Daniel arrived alone on a small transport ship. He walked through the crystal halls of the palace without an escort, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty spaces. Varkorian guards watched him pass with expressions that mixed anger and uncertainty. He was led to the grand chamber, where Malthus waited with a dozen of the Empire's most powerful leaders. They sat on elevated platforms, looking down at the small human who stood before them. The chamber was designed to humble visitors. It was a kilometer wide, with walls of living crystal that glowed with inner light. The ceiling was so high, it disappeared into shadows. Everything about the room said that the Empire was vast and eternal and utterly beyond challenge. Daniel Carter stood in the center and looked up at his hosts without any sign of fear. "You've summoned me," he said calmly. "I am here." Malthus leaned forward on his platform. His golden eyes burned with rage. We have traced everything back to you, he said. The rebellions, the defections, the chaos. It all leads to one human diplomat who has been traveling the galaxy, spreading poison wherever he goes. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That is a serious accusation. Do you have evidence? We do not need evidence. Malthois gestured at the other council members. We are the Varkorian Empire. We have ruled the stars for 12,000 years. Our word is law. Your word was law, Daniel corrected gently. Things have changed. The chamber went silent. No one had spoken to the High Council like that in living memory. Malthois rose from his seat and descended to the floor. He was 3 times Daniel's height, covered in natural armor that could stop plasma bolts. He could have killed the human with a single blow. Do you know what I could do to you? He asked quietly. Right now, in this room, I could tear you apart with my bare hands. No one would stop me. No one would question it. Daniel looked up at the towering alien without flinching. Yes, he said, you could kill me, but it would not change anything. The rebellion would continue. The defections would continue. The Empire would keep falling apart. Because I did not create this situation, I simply helped people see what was already true. And what is that? Daniel smiled. It was a cold smile, empty of warmth or humor. That you are not gods. That your power is not infinite. That 12,000 years of cruelty have created an ocean of hatred waiting to rise. I did not make the waves. I simply showed people that they could swim. Malthois stared down at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his platform. You killed my daughter, Daniel continued, his voice still calm and even. You killed 200,000 people on New Haven because you wanted to remind the galaxy that you could do whatever you wished. You thought there would be no consequences because you were powerful and we were weak. He spread his hands. But power is not just ships and weapons. Power is belief. Power is fear. You taught an entire galaxy to fear you. Now, I have taught them something else. I have taught them that you can be hurt, that you can be challenged, that you are not invincible. One of the council members spoke up. We could destroy every human world, burn Earth itself, wipe your species from existence. Yes, Daniel agreed. You could try, but how many of your soldiers would follow that order? How many of your captains would fire on civilian populations? Your empire is already crumbling from within. A genocide would only speed its collapse. He paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. You have no good options left. That is the price of ruling through fear. When fear stops working, you have nothing to fall back on. No loyalty, no love, no true believers. Just enemies everywhere, waiting for their chance. Malthois slammed his fist against his platform. The sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. What do you want? He demanded. Why did you come here? To gloat? To threaten us? Daniel shook his head slowly. I came because you summoned me, and I came to offer you a choice. You can fight to keep your empire, killing millions in a war you will eventually lose. Or you can negotiate, accept reforms, give the conquered peoples their freedom, build something new from the ashes of the old. Surrender, Malthois said bitterly. You want us to surrender. I want you to survive, Daniel said. If you fight, you will destroy yourselves. If you negotiate, you might keep some of what you have. Some power. Some influence. Some dignity. He stepped closer, and something in his manner made even the great Malthois draw back slightly. My daughter would have wanted peace. She would have wanted me to offer you mercy, so I am offering it once. Now, this is the only chance you will get. The chamber was silent. The council members looked at each other, seeing their own fear reflected in familiar eyes. Finally, Malthois spoke. We will consider your offer, he said. The words seemed to cost him physical pain. Daniel nodded. Do not take too long. The galaxy is watching, and patience is not something I have much of anymore. He turned and walked out of the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence. Behind him, the rulers of a dying empire sat in their crystal towers and wondered, What would come next? The war that followed was not the war anyone expected. The Varkorian Empire had prepared for centuries of military conflict. They had built weapons that could shatter planets. They had trained soldiers who knew no fear. They believed that when the final battle came, they would crush their enemies with overwhelming force. But there was no final battle. There was no great fleet engagement. There was no heroic last stand. Instead, the Empire simply fell apart. Soldiers refused to fire on civilians. Officers defected with their entire commands. Governors declared independence and closed their borders to imperial authority. Ships that had served the Empire for generations turned around and went home. The rebellion did not need to fight because the Empire no longer had anyone willing to fight for it. 12,000 years of fear and cruelty had left no loyalty, no love, no belief in anything worth defending. When the fear stopped working, there was nothing left. Daniel Carter did not command armies during this time. He continued his diplomatic work, traveling between the emerging free states, helping them coordinate their efforts, helping them build something new from the wreckage of the old. He met with Selvari leaders and helped them plan the reconstruction of their homeland. He negotiated trade agreements between the Kelthari and a dozen other species. He sat in meetings that lasted for days, working out the details of a new galactic order. Katie Morgan stayed with him through all of it. She had given up trying to understand what drove him. She simply did her job and watched as the man who had brought down an empire quietly helped build something better. 6 months after Daniel's meeting with the High Council, the Varkorian Empire sued for peace. High Speaker Malthois came to the negotiating table himself. He was older now, his golden eyes dimmed by defeat. The proud alien who had once dismissed the massacre of 200,000 humans as a minor correction now sat across from Daniel Carter and asked for mercy. The negotiations lasted 3 months. Every detail was argued over. Every word was carefully chosen. The final treaty was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. The Empire would withdraw from all conquered territories. Reparations would be paid to species that had suffered under imperial rule. A new galactic federation would be established. With equal representation for all member worlds, the Varkorians would keep their home systems and their dignity. They would be part of the new order, not as masters, but as equals. It was more than many thought they deserved. On the day the treaty was signed, Malthois approached Daniel in private. They stood in a small room overlooking the signing ceremony. Below them, representatives from 100 species gathered to witness the end of one era and the beginning of another. "You have destroyed everything my people built," Malthois said quietly. 12,000 years of civilization, brought down by a single human with nothing but words. Daniel did not answer immediately. Watched the ceremony below, his face unreadable. "You could have had peace," he said finally. "Real peace, built on respect instead of fear. You chose differently. You chose to believe that power meant the right to do whatever you wanted without consequence." He turned to face Malthois. "My daughter was 7 years old. Her name was Sophie. She liked to draw pictures of spaceships. She wanted to explore the galaxy someday, to meet all the different species, to make friends everywhere she went." His voice was steady, but something in it had gone hollow. "She would have hated what I had become. She would have wanted me to forgive you. She would have wanted me to find a better way, a path that did not require for years of shadow warfare and the deaths of millions." Look back at the ceremony below. "But you did not give me that choice. You took her from me. You burned her alive along with 200,000 others, and you called it a correction. You gave me only the tools you understand: fear, pain, consequence." He met Malthois's eyes one last time. "So I used them, and now we are here." Malthois said nothing. There was nothing to say. Daniel Carter attended the signing ceremony and shook hands with the appropriate officials. He smiled for the cameras and gave a brief speech about hope and cooperation. Then he left. He resigned from the diplomatic service 6 months later. His work was done. Others could handle the details of building the new federation. Katie Morgan visited him once, years later. She had risen to become a senior diplomat herself, helping to guide the new galactic order that Daniel had made possible. She found him living on a small colony world far from the major trade routes. He had a simple house with a garden, and he spent his days tending plants and watching the sky. "The Federation is thriving," she told him. "The former imperial subjects are building new societies. There has not been a major conflict in 3 years." "Good," Daniel said. "That is good. People want to honor you. They want to build statues and name stations after you. They call you the architect of freedom, the man who taught an empire fear." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I am not a hero," he said. "I am a man who lost everything and spent 4 years making others feel the same loss. That the result was freedom for billions does not change what lived in my heart while I did it." He pointed to a small stone marker at the edge of his garden. Katie walked over and read the name carved into it. "Sophie Carter." "That is the only monument I need," Daniel said quietly. "The rest is just history making excuses for what people do to each other." Katie stayed for dinner. They talked about old times and new developments, about people they had known and places they had been. Daniel laughed sometimes, a sound she had not heard from him in years. When she left, walked her to her transport, and shook her hand. "Thank you for visiting," he said. "It was good to see you. Will you ever come back?" she asked. "The galaxy still needs diplomats. Good ones are hard to find." Daniel smiled. It was a tired smile, but there was warmth in it for the first time since New Haven. "Perhaps someday," he said, "when I am ready. When I have finished becoming whoever I am supposed to be now." We watched her ship climb into the sky until it disappeared among the stars. Then he walked back to his garden and knelt beside his daughter's memorial stone. The evening light was fading, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere above, the galaxy continued its slow turn, full of new nations and new possibilities and new hope. Daniel Carter had taught an empire to fear. He had brought down a civilization that had stood for 12,000 years. He had changed the course of galactic history. But in the quiet of his garden, with the stars coming out one by one, he was just a father who missed his daughter. A man who had done terrible things for reasons that felt like love. He sat there until full darkness came, remembering a little girl who had drawn pictures of spaceships and dreamed of touching the stars. Then he went inside, closed his door against the night, and tried to find peace. The galaxy would remember Daniel Carter as a legend. He would remember himself only as a man who had lost everything that mattered. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps neither was enough. The stars burned on, bright and cold and indifferent, and somewhere in the darkness, new stories were already beginning.